Good morning. Thanks very much for inviting me, and it's a great honor to be speaking in front of such an august group on an issue that I've been wrestling with implicitly for a long time, but this conference and the invitation to write a paper for it gave me a chance to make explicit my ongoing wrestlings with trying to underpin a social theoretical and political theoretical component into broader musings about the role of building the rule of law and local level justice. So what I'm going to do in my talk is sort of give you a sense of the background motivation for what I do and where this paper is coming from. And then I'm going to talk about at a higher unit of analysis than the previous presentations. This is an array of different cases addressing some pretty key issues, I think, in building local level justice and justice and rule of law more generally. Then look at the particular role that deliberation has played in those, and look at whether and how this might be even beginning to the basis for development policy. I work here in the research department of the World Bank. That's been my pleasure over the last 12 years to do that. I'm the only sociologist, though, amongst the research department in the 100-odd staff in the research group, and most of my life actually now is spent working with lawyers. So as Burke said, you sort of need to be aware of what you don't know, and I'm sort of on an hourly basis sort of reminded of what I don't know. But in the engagement with the law, I'm sort of currently at that sort of first-year law student stage of feeling the beauty of the law. In the same way that mathematicians talk about the beauty of mathematics or the beauty of poetry, the law is beautiful. And I'm sufficiently enamored with all of that to spend a lot of my time trying to get my handle around something that I didn't study and perhaps retrospectively should have. But now find myself in a leadership role on the World Bank's Justice for the Poor program, which I helped set up 8 years ago. It's a global research and development program that emerged out of a lot of our work in Indonesia, which I'll touch on at some point. From Indonesia, we went to Cambodia, and then now to 9 different countries in the world. We have over 50 people who work on all of this, and very much coming at it in some part, and indeed have been able to secure funding for this work, in part because we've been able to try and explain, why too many, I should say, for small qualified, too many of the efforts to engage in rule of law reform have been utter failures. And trying to argue that part of the reason for that failure has been the mental model or theory of change that's been invoked to try and do that. And so if we're going to try and have a slightly better track record of doing this kind of work, then altering the software, altering the sort of the theory of change that we bring to bear on this particular question might stand a better chance of engagement and actually working. So as a result of the 2005 WDR that several of us in this room worked on equity and development, we were able to use the discursive space, literally, that was created by the production of that report as a way of being able to go to various different donors who are all at one level unambiguously committed to building the rule of law, but their own efforts at actually doing that were littered with embarrassments and things they would rather not talk about. And we were able to plausibly convince them that at least the initial work that we had done in this field could be the basis for a different and alternative way of doing that. So in various different papers that I've written with my colleagues in this project, we've gone about trying to implicitly sort of write what we think our theory is. Why are we doing this the way that we're doing it, and how does it differ from how others have done it in the past? In a separate paper, or actually as part of this paper, I have a section where we look at why this weird dynamic has existed for so long, why you can have 40 years essentially of a consensus around the importance of this as an object of reform, and yet have 40 years of companion failure, and yet the model never ever changing. And still today, even, that you still see so much of that occurring. What is that model? Well, in its crudest form, it's basically accelerated modernization through transplanted best practice. Put it into fancier sociological terminology, isomorphic mimicry, even more popular terminology, cut and paste. It is whatever works somewhere, we cut it, and we take it and move it around the world somewhere else. And that has been the basis for public sector financial reform, land administration, even in education and health. We see the reproduction of what Peter has called institutional monocropping, just sort of taking the same sort of thing around the world. Now, if we recognize, I think the law, part of what makes it beautiful to me as a sociologist is that it's a quintessential social construction. It is a quintessential invention of humanity to try and constrain bad guys from doing terrible things to their people, to facilitate exchange, to resolve disputes in a non-violent way. It does all of these kind of things, but we invent them. Humans have created it. And so reading the history of how indeed groups of people were able to construct a system that was able to do this is part of the joy of doing this kind of work, and it builds on other project that I did with Bijou on trying to take far more seriously than we do history in our thinking around development policy. Anyway, so that's sort of where I was coming from with this. So the challenge was for us as a program in Justice for the Poor is sort of how can we articulate more forcefully, more rigorously an alternative theory of change, but how can that simultaneously draw on a broader set of scholarship around this question, but also our own first-hand field research on attempting in and through a large development agency like the bank to try and do this, right? So you can have very legitimate reasons for being terrified that the bank is engaging with this kind of work in this kind of way. But I like to think that we're doing this with a very different set of mental models in place, drawing on a very different line of scholarship that at the end of the day is largely, I hope, a complement to the way in which this has been done in the past. But ultimately, we are really trying to think about this in very different ways. So I just love this initial photo which I got yesterday, because one of the sort of common phrases in the law is talking about the shadow of the law, that we operate so oftentimes in the absence of, rather the law is there, we're just so unaware of it. And the sort of the notion that the law is there, we can't really see it, but it casts this big shadow, and that part of the modernization of the world is the extension of this shadow, so to enable indeed much of what we take for granted in modern life to be possible. Anyway. So there's various different literatures that are sort of engaged with this, which I won't spend my time in going into here, except to say that these are largely supply-side accounts in my reading of them. The stories are much more to do with, if you read the influential book that Doug North just did a year or so ago, Violence and Social Orders, it's an almost exclusively supply-side story about how the rule of law was extended. It's a privileges into rights story, how a club, essentially, a group of wealthy elites, set up a system that enabled them to exchange with each other without killing one another, but that was inherently a permeable and shot through with holes that enabled ever larger groups and constituencies of people to sort of bolt their claims onto this, and thereby the system eventually extended out. So I'm not going to dispute that in some sense, but what I do want to try and bring into this is sort of a demand-side account. How were social movements, how were different groups, indeed how were professional lawyers themselves as a professional constituency involved in trying to extend the rule of law and justice to broader groups of people. And indeed how the rule of law itself shapes the nature and extent of the deliberative space. And I think that's a really important issue for this conference and for this paper. So what I did was to try and to sort of look at an array of different cases and try and look at the different pathways by which a greater or lesser justice sort of steps had occurred. I sort of have 6 of these, which I just simplified as cooptation, codification, legislation, deliberative contestation, invocation, and mediation. And let me just sort of briefly give you some examples of what the issues are that I think those particular strategies are addressing. Then in this next slide, I'll touch on what I think are the roles of deliberation in each of those strategies, and what some of the limits are as well. In the cooptation strategy, I think that this is essentially a response to various different forms of oppression and tyranny. A brilliant book that I'm reading at the moment by Jeffrey Robinson, which is on called the Tyrannicide Brief, which is on the case of Charles I, who was the first ever head of state to be charged under rule of law. Brilliant, moving book, just extraordinary. But we now, in some sense, we take that for granted, that no one is above the law. Unless you read Dahlia Lithwick on the Slate magazine yesterday, who wrote a wonderful article on what the torture cases here in the US are doing. So they can be backsliding from that. Nonetheless, the way in which groups were able to bring everybody under the rule of law, that the divine right of kings was no longer going to prevail. How did that actually happen? Well, it was an extraordinary case of how lawyers were able to use the existing law in order to be able to build a case, even though it meant certain death for them, in order to be able to move both the moral calculus of the broader population and of Parliament, but also the law itself in successfully being able to try a tyrannical head of state who had killed 10% of his population by the time he was finally brought to trial. The more usual way in which perhaps we talk about this is in codification or in preemption, is the more formal legal term that Rick has written on very well, and that Hernando de Soto made famous, where people were basically insecure or living under rather ad hoc systems of rights, property rights in particular, and that the most expedient strategy, at least in the case of the US Midwest, and where the case that he's talking about most eloquently there, is how that system, just the rule of law comes just by extending itself on and layering itself over the top of an existing set of arrangements. As we'll see shortly, that has huge inequities potentially built into it, and Jim Scott's work on Weapons of the Weak was arguing very persuasively that oftentimes a key strategy for marginalized groups is to get the hell away from the rule of law, because once it's in a domain of law, then that in itself disempowers them, because they just don't have the legal skills and the capacities to be able to fight a fair fight in that particular domain. Nonetheless, I think in the broader scheme of modernization, the codification of existing systems is one plausible way in which this can happen. Legislation is perhaps the most familiar way, at least when you've already got an existing legislative apparatus that can even do that. But it's how you get to the point where you have a legislative apparatus that's capable of being able to extend rights and privileges and social policies to other people is interesting. I have a good colleague, Simon Schroeder, who's written wonderfully on the poor law, which was the first pro-poor policy enacted in the UK in the 1600s. 1500s and 1600s as a policy by the legislature as it existed at that stage, to try and provide the basis of the world's first social protection system. So there are ways, even in the most fledgling legislative systems, whereby the law can be moved or mobilized in such a way that it benefits marginalized groups. The ones that I've written on most personally myself with Chris Gibson and with Daniel Adler are cases that come from Indonesia and Cambodia, where we are looking through the very deep engagement with, in one case, the KDP, the Kecamatan Development Project in Indonesia, which we've studied for a long time, looking at different ways in which marginalized groups were able to engage more equitably in participative dialogue in their own villages around the access to resources. We've tried to argue here, we tried to build this whole notion there about this idea, building on Arjun's earlier work on the capacity to aspire, extending this to the capacity to engage, and saying that it wasn't enough just simply to shift the demographics, to change the skin color or the gender of the people in the room. What you really had to do was alter the terms of debate itself. If it's debate about the internal rate of return on my project versus your project, and I'm enumerate, then I'm never going to win that debate, because I don't even know what that term means. So the fact that I'm in the meeting itself is nice, but if the way in the plane on which the debate is occurring is such that I am disenfranchised because I can't even open my mouth and utter a sensible statement about cost-benefit analysis or anything like that, then you're disempowered. So the question we are asking, and one of the things that I'm most enamored with by the KDP approach, at least within Indonesia itself, has been how it's been able to structure it and design itself in ways that are able to accommodate the particular discursive claim-making modalities that marginalized groups favor, and use that as the basis for influencing claim making in a public square, in a public forum, that also then has various different accountability and transparency requirements built into it as well. In the work with Daniel we've done in Cambodia, has been looking at labor reform in an environment where you have Fortune 500 companies arrayed against a highly neo-patrimonial state, arrayed against non-unionized 19-year-old workers. right? So how on earth are you trying to get equitable wages and conditions occurring under those kinds of conditions?